Warsaw, 1942. In the maternity ward of a hospital whose walls still bore the scars of German artillery, a midwife named Stanisława Leszczyńska pressed her trembling hands against the cold metal of a delivery table and made a decision that would condemn her soul or save it forever. The baby she had just delivered was Jewish. The mother, barely 20 years old, lay exhausted on blood-stained sheets, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the pain of childbirth. Outside, in the corridors of the hospital, Nazi officers were conducting their routine inspections, checking birth certificates, verifying bloodlines, marking infants for deportation with the cold efficiency of accountants tallying inventory. This woman had come to Stanisława not because she wanted a safe delivery, but because she had heard whispers in the underground networks, rumors of a midwife who could make Jewish babies disappear and replace them with Christian ones. The question that hung in that sterile room, thick as the smell of disinfectant and fear, was simple and monstrous. Would Stanisława actually do it? Would she really swap this newborn Jewish child with a Christian baby born just hours before? Condemning one family to save another, playing God with birth certificates and identity papers, while the Third Reich tightened its noose around every Jewish neck in occupied Poland. The history books will tell you about the resistance fighters who blew up trains and the diplomats who forged thousands of visas. They will tell you about the soldiers who stormed beaches and the spies who stole Nazi secrets. But they will not tell you about the women who committed the most intimate betrayals to save lives. The midwives who turned maternity wards into theaters of identity theft, who looked into the eyes of desperate mothers and made promises that violated every oath they had ever taken. This is not a story about heroes who carried guns or led armies. This is a story about a woman who weaponized the one moment when human identity is most vulnerable, most fluid, most dependent on a single handwritten document and a tired bureaucrat stamp. This is about the underground network of Polish midwives who discovered that in the chaos of wartime births, in hospitals overwhelmed with casualties, and staffed by overworked nurses, who could barely tell one screaming infant from another, babies could vanish and reappear with different names, different parents, different fates. Poland in 1942 was a nation that had ceased to exist on maps, but refused to die in spirit. The German occupation had transformed Warsaw from a vibrant European capital into a nightmare of checkpoints, deportations, and summary executions. The Jewish ghetto, walled off from the rest of the city, was a slow-motion death sentence where hundreds of thousands were packed into a few city blocks, starving while they awaited transport to camps whose names would become synonyms for hell itself. Treblinka, Awitz, Sura. Every day, trains left Warsaw packed with human cargo that would never return. Every day, the Nazi bureaucracy processed paperwork with Germanic precision, tracking every Jew, every Romani, every person deemed unworthy of life under the racial laws of the Third Reich. And every day in hospitals and clinics across occupied Poland, babies were born into this machinery of death. Their fates sealed the moment a doctor recorded their mother's names on official documents. But Stanisława Leszczyńska was not just any midwife. Born in 1896 in Łódź, she had spent her entire adult life bringing children into the world, had guided thousands of women through labor, had held thousands of newborns in her skilled hands. She was a devout Catholic, a mother herself, a woman who believed in the sanctity of life and the divine order of creation. She was also a woman who had watched the Nazis murder her neighbors, who had seen Jewish children torn from their mother's arms and thrown into trucks like sacks of grain, who had heard the screams echoing from the ghetto walls. When the war began, Stanisława made a choice that tens of millions of Europeans failed to make. She decided that her faith demanded action, not prayer. She decided that if God had given her the power to bring life into the world, then perhaps he expected her to use that power to save it, even if it meant breaking every rule, violating every law, and committing acts that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The mechanics of the operation were terrifyingly simple. A pregnant Jewish woman, her identity papers marked with the red J that meant deportation and death, would arrive at the hospital in labor. Stanisława would deliver the baby in a private room away from the prying eyes of German inspectors. Then within hours she would locate a Christian woman who had also given birth. preferably one whose baby had been stillborn or had died shortly after delivery. The paperwork would be altered. Names would be switched. The Jewish baby would be given to the Christian mother, who would raise the child as her own, often never knowing the truth. The Jewish mother would leave the hospital empty-armed, her grief real, but her child alive somewhere in occupied Poland, hidden in plain sight among the Christian population. And the dead Christian baby, if one existed, would be registered under the Jewish mother's name, its death certificate becoming a cover story for a life that continued elsewhere under a stolen identity. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant immediate execution, not just for Stanisława, but for every mother, every baby, every nurse and administrator who participated in the deception. The Nazis had made it clear that anyone caught hiding Jews or falsifying documents would be shot in the street as a lesson to others. Every birth became a calculated gamble. Every forged certificate a potential death sentence. Every crying infant a time bomb waiting to explode if someone noticed the wrong blood type, the wrong facial features, the wrong answers to the wrong questions. Yet in that maternity ward in Warsaw 1942, Stanisława Legzinska looked at that terrified young Jewish mother and decided that some choices are not really choices at all. Some acts of mercy are simply obligations that history demands, regardless of the cost. The question was not whether she would do it. The question was how many times she could do it before the machinery of genocide caught up with her. Before the paperwork revealed the pattern, before someone noticed that far too many Jewish babies were dying, while Christian families were suddenly blessed with unexpected children, whose features did not quite match their supposed parents. The system that made Stanisław's mission possible was the same system designed to make it impossible: German bureaucratic precision. The Nazis were obsessed with documentation, with papers, with stamps and signatures, and official records that tracked every citizen from cradle to grave. Birth certificates were not simple announcements of arrival, but legal documents that determined whether a child would live or die, whether they would receive ration cards or deportation orders, whether their existence would be tolerated or terminated. In the chaos of occupied Poland, where hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers and civilian casualties, where power outages were common and record-keeping was constantly disrupted by bombing raids and resistance attacks, this obsession with paperwork created vulnerabilities. A midwife who understood the system, who knew which forms needed which stamps, who had cultivated relationships with sympathetic clerks and exhausted administrators, could exploit those vulnerabilities. Stanisława had spent decades working within the Polish medical system, had delivered babies for the families of doctors and nurses, had earned trust through competence and compassion. Now she would weaponize that trust, turning colleagues into co-conspirators, transforming her maternity ward into the front line of a war fought not with bullets, but with altered birth certificates and whispered lies. The network began small, almost accidentally in the winter of 1941. A Jewish woman Stanisława had known before the war arrived at the hospital in labor. Her papers already marked for deportation. The baby was born healthy, a girl with dark eyes and a powerful cry that seemed to fill the entire ward. Stanisława held that infant and understood with absolute clarity that if she filled out the birth certificate honestly, if she recorded the mother's Jewish name and address in the ghetto, she would be signing a death warrant for a child barely 10 minutes old. There was a Christian woman 2 rooms away whose baby had been stillborn just hours earlier. A tragedy that Stanisława had witnessed with professional detachment until this moment when tragedy suddenly became opportunity. The swap was executed in darkness, with shaking hands and racing heart. The Jewish mother left with grief written on her face, but hope hidden in her eyes. The Christian mother, drugged with painkillers and exhausted from labor, accepted the living baby Stanisława placed in her arms, never questioning why her supposedly dead child was now miraculously breathing. The first deception was the hardest, the moment when Stanisława crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, when she transformed from a midwife who followed rules into a forger who broke them. But word spread through the underground networks with the speed of desperation. Jewish families facing deportation began seeking out Stanisława, specifically arriving at the hospital, with cover stories about routine pregnancies while their real purpose was written in their terrified eyes. The Polish resistance, that loose network of fighters and informants and ordinary citizens who refused to accept German rule, began funneling pregnant Jewish women to Stanisław's ward. She developed a system, a protocol refined through repetition and narrow escapes. Certain nurses were recruited, sworn to secrecy under threat of mutual destruction. Clerks in the records office were bribed or convinced through appeals to conscience. Christian families who had lost babies were approached with careful questions, their grief manipulated into participation. The operation required timing, coordination, and an almost supernatural ability to predict which births would align, which families would cooperate, which moments of chaos could be exploited to switch one infant for another, without triggering the suspicion of German inspectors who randomly audited hospital records looking for exactly this kind of resistance activity. The psychological toll was immediate and crushing. Stanisława was asking Christian mothers to raise Jewish children as their own, often without full disclosure of the truth, which meant these women might spend years loving a child while subconsciously noting features that did not match, behaviors that seemed foreign, characteristics that triggered uncomfortable questions. She was asking Jewish mothers to abandon their newborns to strangers, to trust that somewhere in occupied Poland, their children would survive, and perhaps if the war ever ended could be reclaimed. She was creating a generation of children who would grow up not knowing their true identities, who would carry secrets in their blood that no birth certificate could erase. Every successful swap meant another family torn apart, another truth buried, another lie that would have to be maintained for years or decades. Stanisława began having nightmares, visions of all the babies she had switched, suddenly crying out in unison, their voices merging into an accusation that followed her through waking hours. She confessed her actions to a priest who told her that sometimes sin and salvation are inseparable, that God judges the heart, not the paperwork, that in a world gone mad, the only truly immoral act is indifference. By the spring of 1942, Stanisława Leszczyńska had successfully swapped approximately 15 babies, give or take the ones she could not precisely track, because the chaos of war made record-keeping as much an art as a science. 15 Jewish children who should have been deported to death camps were instead living under Christian names in Christian homes. Their existence a testament to the strange arithmetic of wartime morality, where saving one life required devastating another family with a stillbirth that might be real or fabricated. The operation had become more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more necessary as the pace of deportations accelerated. The Nazis were emptying the Warsaw Ghetto with industrial efficiency, and every day brought new, desperate women to Stanisław's door, their bellies swollen with children who would be murdered unless someone intervened. The maternity ward had become a last sanctuary, a place where Jewish women could give birth, and perhaps, if luck and timing aligned, give their babies a chance at survival by erasing their identities and grafting them onto Christian family trees. But luck, as Stanisław was learning, was a finite resource, and timing could only be manipulated so many times before the pattern became visible to anyone looking closely enough at the birth and death records of one particular Warsaw hospital. The moment Stanisława had been dreading arrived on a gray morning in May, when a German officer named Klaus Richter walked into her maternity ward with a clipboard and an expression of bureaucratic irritation. He was not Gestapo, not SS, just a mid-level administrator tasked with auditing hospital records to ensure compliance with racial laws, the kind of functionary who processed genocide with the same emotional detachment he might bring to reviewing tax returns. Richter had noticed an anomaly in the statistics. The Jewish infant mortality rate at Stanisław's hospital was significantly higher than at other Warsaw facilities, while the Christian birth rate showed unusual spikes that did not correlate with demographic projections. In the logic of Nazi racial science, Jews were supposedly inferior, more prone to disease and weakness, so higher mortality among Jewish infants was expected and even celebrated. But Rtor was a thorough man, the type who found satisfaction in catching discrepancies, and something about the numbers felt wrong to him in ways he could not immediately articulate. He informed Stanisław that he would be conducting random inspections of the maternity ward over the coming weeks, cross-referencing birth certificates with mother interviews, checking blood types, examining infant features against parental characteristics. His message was clear. If there was fraud occurring, he would find it, and the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. Stanisława knew she had two choices: shut down the operation immediately and condemn every pregnant Jewish woman who would arrive in the coming months to deportation, or continue the swaps with the knowledge that discovery was now not just possible, but likely. She consulted with the resistance contacts who had been funneling women to her, with the nurses who had become her accomplices, with the priest who had absolved her sins and encouraged her mission. The consensus was unanimous. Continue. The deportations had reached fever pitch, with entire neighborhoods of the ghetto being emptied daily. Trains left Warsaw every morning, packed with humanity, destined for extermination camps, whose existence was still officially denied, but universally understood. To stop now would be to abandon the most vulnerable victims at their moment of greatest need. So, Stanisław refined her methods, became more cautious, more selective. She could no longer swap every Jewish baby that arrived in her ward. Instead, she focused on cases where the timing was perfect, where Christian mothers had genuinely lost infants to stillbirth or early death, where the physical characteristics matched closely enough to avoid suspicion. She developed a network of lookouts who would warn her when German inspectors were approaching, giving her time to ensure that any Jewish mothers currently in labor were hidden or had cover stories prepared that could withstand interrogation. The narrow escapes became routine, each one shaving years off Stanisława's life through accumulated stress. There was the afternoon when RTOR arrived unannounced and demanded to see a specific birth certificate that Stanisław had altered just hours earlier, the ink barely dry on the forged signatures. She handed him the document with hands she willed not to shake, watching his eyes scan the details, searching for the discrepancy that would expose everything. He questioned her about the mother's address, about the attending physician, about details that Stanisław had to invent on the spot, while maintaining the confident demeanor of someone with nothing to hide. After 10 minutes, that felt like 10 hours. RTOR handed back the certificate with a grunt of dissatisfaction and moved on to other files. Stanisław excused herself to the bathroom and vomited from the adrenaline crash, her body finally processing the terror her mind had suppressed during the inspection. Another time, a Jewish mother whose baby Stanisław had swapped weeks earlier returned to the hospital with a different complaint. Not realizing that Rita was conducting one of his random audits, the woman's papers clearly identified her as Jewish, and her presence in the maternity ward, where she supposedly had given birth to a stillborn child, created questions that RTOR began asking with increased suspicion. Stanisława had to quickly fabricate a story about follow-up care for complications. Medical jargon delivered with enough confidence to overwhelm RTOR's limited understanding of obstetrics, all while steering him away from the records room where a careful comparison of dates would reveal impossible coincidences. The psychological warfare was constant and exhausting. Stanisław began to see suspicion in every face, threat in every unexpected visitor, exposure in every clerical error. She lost weight, developed insomnia, started drinking vodka before bed just to quiet her mind long enough to sleep for a few hours. Her own children, grown adults by this point, noticed her deterioration, but knew better than to ask questions that might implicate them in whatever dangerous activities their mother was pursuing. The resistance contacts warned her that they had intelligence suggesting Richter was building a case, that he had flagged her hospital for deeper investigation, that a Gestapo unit specializing in uncovering Jewish hiding operations might soon become involved. The smart move, the survivable move, would be to stop immediately, to let the trail go cold, to return to being just another midwife following German regulations. But every time Stanisław resolved to end the operation, another desperate Jewish woman would arrive in labor, her eyes holding the same question that haunted all of them. Will you let my baby die because saving it is too dangerous for you? And every time Stanisław found she could not say yes to survival if it meant saying no to mercy. By the summer of 1942, Stanisława had swapped approximately 30 babies, a number that represented 30 Jewish children living under false identities, and 30 Christian families carrying secrets that could destroy them. The operation had reached a scale where maintaining secrecy required not just Stanisław's skills, but an entire network of complicit nurses, sympathetic doctors, bribed clerks, and resistance contacts who moved information and people through occupied Warsaw with increasing desperation as the Nazi noose tightened. The maternity ward had become a battleground where the war was fought not with weapons but with falsified documents and whispered arrangements and split-second decisions made in delivery rooms, while German inspectors patrolled the corridors outside. Stanislawa understood that she was living on borrowed time, that eventually the pattern would become undeniable, that Richter or someone like him would piece together the evidence and arrive with soldiers instead of clipboards. The question was no longer whether she would be caught, but how many more babies she could save before the inevitable happened. How many more lies she could sustain before the truth collapsed and brought down everyone who had helped her commit these strange acts of mercy, disguised as crimes against the state. The techniques Stanislawa perfected over those terrifying months required an understanding of human psychology as much as medical expertise. She learned that new mothers, especially those sedated during difficult deliveries, existed in a fog of exhaustion and hormones that made them malleable, suggestible, vulnerable to narratives that might otherwise trigger suspicion. A Christian woman told her baby died during birth would accept a living infant hours later. If Stanislawa claimed the initial assessment was wrong, that the child had merely been unconscious, that miracles sometimes happened in maternity wards, the key was confidence. An unshakable certainty in her voice that overrode the mother's instinctive questions about why this supposedly resurrected baby looked slightly different than the glimpse she might have caught before losing consciousness. Stanislawa would place the Jewish infant in the Christian mother's arms with such matter-of-fact authority that doubt became impossible, transforming deception into medical procedure, making theft feel like salvation. She studied each baby's features obsessively before attempting a swap, matching hair color and skin tone and bone structure with the precision of an artist, rejecting opportunities when the differences were too pronounced, waiting for that perfect alignment of timing and physiology that made the substitution invisible. The Jewish mothers faced an entirely different ordeal, one that stripped them of the most fundamental human experience, holding their own child. Stanislawa developed a protocol of brutal efficiency, where these women would labor, knowing that the moment of birth would also be the moment of separation, that they would see their babies for perhaps 30 seconds, before Stanislawa whisked the infants away under the pretense of emergency medical care. Some mothers demanded more time, begged to nurse just once, pleaded for a chance to memorize their children's faces. Stanislawa had to harden herself against these requests, had to become almost cruel in her refusals, because every extra minute increased the risk of exposure. Every delay gave German inspectors more opportunity to arrive and find a Jewish baby where none should exist. She would explain in flat clinical terms that their choice was simple: give up the baby now with a chance of survival, or hold the baby for an hour, and guarantee deportation for both mother and child. Most accepted this calculus with the numb resignation of people who had already watched their worlds collapse. A few refused, chose to keep their babies despite knowing what that choice meant, and Stanislawa would watch them leave the hospital carrying infants who would be dead within weeks, murdered in gas chambers whose existence the Reich still officially denied, while running them with industrial efficiency. The resistance network that supported Stanislawa's operation was a strange ecosystem of believers and pragmatists, of people motivated by faith and others driven by simple human decency that refused to accept genocide as normal. There was Father Marcin, a priest who used his position to forge baptismal certificates that would support the false identities Stanislawa created, who argued in his sermons that saving Jews was not politics, but Christianity's most basic commandment. There was Ina, a nurse whose entire family had been executed by the Nazis for harboring a Jewish neighbor, who threw herself into the baby-swapping operation with the fervor of someone seeking revenge through rescue. There was Tomas, a clerk in the records office who had lost his own children to scarlet fever, and now manipulated bureaucracy to save other people's babies, who spent his evenings carefully backdating documents and forging signatures with the meticulous skill of a counterfeiter. These people formed a web of protection around Stanislawa's maternity ward, each one performing small acts of sabotage and deception that collectively made the impossible routine. They shared information about German patrol schedules, warned each other about surprise inspections, created false paper trails that would confuse investigators trying to trace the anomalies in birth and death statistics. The emotional damage accumulated in ways that would not become fully visible until years later, if survival even granted them years. Stanislawa began experiencing what she could only describe as a fragmentation of identity, a sense that she was simultaneously multiple people living incompatible lives. There was the professional midwife who followed German regulations, who submitted correct paperwork, who treated Nazi officers with polite efficiency when they toured the hospital. There was the resistance operative who trafficked in forged documents and smuggled babies, who broke laws with the casual frequency of someone brushing their teeth. There was the Catholic woman who prayed every night for forgiveness and guidance, who wondered whether God approved of her methods, or merely tolerated them as necessary evils in a fallen world. And underneath all these identities was something raw and more frightened. A middle-aged woman terrified of torture and execution, who understood that her choices had painted a target on her back that grew more visible with every successful swap. She started writing letters she never intended to send, confessional documents hidden in her home that detailed every baby she had saved, every family she had connected, a record that might survive even if she did not. The impulse was simultaneously hopeful and fatalistic, a belief that this story deserved to be remembered, coupled with an acceptance that she personally might not live to tell it. What haunted Stanisław most during those long nights when sleep refused to come was not the fear of capture, but the mathematics of selection, the impossible calculus that forced her to choose which babies to save when she could not save them all. Resources were finite, opportunities were limited, and the tide of Jewish women arriving at her hospital exceeded her capacity to help everyone. She developed criteria that felt simultaneously rational and monstrous. She prioritized mothers who had Christian friends willing to adopt, babies whose features would blend easily into Polish society, situations where the timing of births aligned perfectly for swaps. This meant she necessarily rejected cases that were too risky, too complicated, too likely to expose the entire operation. She would deliver Jewish babies knowing she would register them under their real mothers' names, effectively signing their deportation orders, choosing the security of her network over the lives of individual infants. These were the children who invaded her dreams, the ones she could not save, their faces blending together into an accusation that followed her through waking hours. The resistance contacts told her to stop thinking this way, reminded her that 30 saved lives were 30 more than would have existed without her intervention. That guilt was a luxury reserved for peacetime when choices were not inevitably tragic. But Stanisława could not silence the voice that whispered she was playing God with inadequate wisdom, that her system of selection was just another form of the same evil she was fighting, that the difference between her and the Nazis was merely one of intention rather than effect. September 1942 brought a crisis that threatened to unravel everything Stanisław had built when a Christian mother named Helena Kowalska arrived at the hospital 6 weeks after adopting what she believed was her miraculously surviving infant. Only this time she brought the baby back with questions that could destroy the entire network. Helena had taken the child to a pediatrician for a routine checkup, and the doctor had noticed something unusual about the infant's blood type. A mismatch that should have been impossible given Helena's medical records from her pregnancy. The pediatrician, an older man with no love for the German occupation, but an abundance of professional curiosity, had begun asking questions about the circumstances of the birth, about why the baby was initially declared dead, about inconsistencies in the hospital documentation. Helena, whose grief over her stillborn child had transformed into fierce maternal love for this replacement baby, suddenly found herself trapped between protecting the child she now considered her own and pursuing a truth that terrified her. She came to Stanisław not with accusations, but with desperation, needing someone to explain how she could be raising a baby whose blood told a different story than the birth certificate claimed. Needing reassurance that she was not losing her mind, or participating in something that would bring Nazi retribution down on her entire family. Stanisław made a decision in that moment that violated every protocol she had established, every rule of operational security that the resistance had drilled into her. She told Helena the truth. She explained that the baby Helena was raising was not her biological child, that the infant had been born to a Jewish mother who was now either dead in Treblinka or hiding somewhere in occupied Poland under a false identity. She described the entire operation, the network of swaps, the forged documents, the desperate calculus that traded one family's grief for another family's hope of survival. She watched Helena's face cycle through shock, betrayal, confusion, and finally a strange kind of understanding that came from living in a world where normal morality had been suspended by circumstances too extreme for conventional ethics. The risk was enormous because Helena could have gone directly to the German authorities, could have exposed the entire network in exchange for clemency or reward, could have destroyed dozens of lives, including her own adopted child's, with a single conversation with the right Nazi official. But Stanislawa had learned to read people during decades of attending births, had developed an instinct for who would collaborate and who would resist. And something in Helena's eyes told her that this woman would choose the baby over the truth, would embrace the lie if it meant protecting the child she had already bonded with despite the false origins. Helena's response exceeded even Stanisława's optimistic assessment when the woman declared she wanted to help, wanted to become part of the network, wanted to use her own grief and her socially acceptable Christian identity to assist other swaps. She proposed a scheme where she would pretend to be pregnant again, faking the progression with padding and careful clothing choices, then claiming to give birth at home with Stanisława's assistance, allowing them to place another Jewish baby directly into a Christian household without the complications of hospital documentation. The plan was audacious and terrifying, requiring Helena to maintain an elaborate deception for months while also caring for the infant she had already adopted. But it opened possibilities Stanislawa had not previously considered. They could bypass some of the most dangerous aspects of the hospital-based swaps, could create babies that appeared to come from nowhere with documentation that would be harder for German inspectors to scrutinize. Within weeks, Helena had recruited 2 other Christian women who had lost babies, creating a small network of surrogate mothers willing to fake pregnancies and accept Jewish infants as their own. The operation was expanding beyond the maternity ward, metastasizing into the broader fabric of Warsaw society, becoming something larger and more dangerous than Stanisława had ever intended. But expansion brought visibility, and visibility brought attention from exactly the people Stanisława had spent months trying to avoid. Klaus Richter returned to the hospital in October with a Gestapo officer named Ernst Kruger, a man whose reputation for uncovering hidden Jews preceded him like a smell of carrion. Kruger specialized in finding the gaps in paperwork, the inconsistencies in stories, the tiny fractures and false identities that could be exploited until entire resistance networks collapsed. He had brought down smuggling operations, exposed safe houses, tortured information out of priests and teachers and ordinary citizens who had thought themselves safe behind layers of deception. Now he stood in Stanisława's office examining birth records with an expression that suggested he already knew what he was looking for, and was merely establishing the evidence trail that would justify arrests and executions. Stanisława maintained her composure through decades of practice at hiding fear, answering Kruger's questions with the confident boredom of someone whose conscience was clear and whose paperwork was legitimate. She watched him compare different files, saw his finger trace patterns in the data, observed the moment when his eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of someone who had found the thread that would unravel everything. He did not arrest her that day, did not even explicitly accuse her of anything, but his parting words carried the weight of prophecy. He would be back with more questions, and he expected better answers than the implausible coincidences she had been offering. That night, Stanisa convened an emergency meeting with her network in the basement of Father Marcin's church, a space that smelled of incense and damp stone, and the accumulated prayers of generations. The consensus was grim. Kruger was building a case, and once he had enough evidence, he would arrest everyone simultaneously to prevent warnings from spreading. They debated shutting down the operation permanently, destroying documents, creating alibis for the months when the swaps had occurred most frequently. But even as they discussed survival strategies, a pregnant Jewish woman arrived at the church seeking Stanisława, her contractions already beginning. Her options reduced to either giving birth and hiding with Stanisława's help or trying to reach the hospital where German inspectors might be waiting. The woman's name was Ruth, and she was 19 years old, and her husband had been shot 3 weeks earlier for attempting to escape the ghetto. She stood in that church basement, with her hands pressed against her swollen belly, and asked the only question that mattered. Would Stanisława help her baby survive, even if it meant risking everything that had been built, even if it meant accelerating the timeline of their inevitable exposure? The silence that followed was filled with the unspoken understanding that they had already crossed too many lines to stop now, that the logic of mercy was inexorable once you started following it, that refusing this woman would make meaningless every risk they had already taken and every baby they had already saved. Ruth gave birth in that church basement, while German patrols passed overhead on the streets above. Her screams muffled by towels and the desperate prayers of Father Marcin, who stood guard at the door, listening for the sound of boots on cobblestones. Stanisław delivered the baby girl with hands that had guided thousands of infants into the world, but had never worked under such primitive conditions, without proper lighting or sterilization or any of the medical equipment that made childbirth survivable when complications arose. The delivery was mercifully straightforward despite the circumstances, and within 2 hours Ruth held a healthy daughter, whose lungs were strong enough to announce her arrival with cries that seemed dangerously loud in that enclosed space. Helena Kowalska was present for the birth, had volunteered to be the Christian mother who would claim this child as her own through the fake pregnancy scheme they had devised. She had spent the previous months wearing progressively larger padding, had told her neighbors and family that she was expecting again after the tragedy of her stillborn child, had created a narrative that would explain the sudden appearance of a newborn without triggering questions. Now she took Ruth's daughter with a mixture of tenderness and guilt, understanding that this moment of transfer was both salvation and theft, that she was participating in something that violated the natural order, even as it served a higher purpose than biology could comprehend. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives because Ruth, weakened from labor and blood loss and the accumulated trauma of surviving in occupied Warsaw, made a request that Stanisław had never encountered before. She asked to nurse the baby one time, to give her daughter the colostrum that would provide immunity and nutrition for the first days of life, to have 30 minutes of motherhood before accepting the permanent separation that survival demanded. Stanisław initially refused on practical grounds because every minute Ruth spent with the baby increased the emotional bond and made the separation more devastating, because the risk of discovery grew with every passing hour they remained in that church basement. But Ruth's eyes held something beyond desperation, a kind of fierce dignity that insisted on claiming at least this fragment of maternal experience before being erased from her daughter's life forever. Helena supported the request, arguing that if they were going to steal this woman's child for good reasons, the least they could do was grant her this small act of connection. So Stanisław relented, and for 30 minutes that seemed to exist outside normal time, Ruth nursed her daughter while the resistance network stood watch and contemplated the particular cruelty of a situation where love required abandonment, where the ultimate act of maternal protection was to become a stranger to your own child. The logistics of Ruth's disappearance after the birth required coordination that stretched the network's resources to their limits. She could not return to her registered address in the ghetto, because her pregnancy had been documented by Nazi medical inspections, and arriving there without a baby would trigger questions about the infant's location. The resistance arranged for her to be smuggled out of Warsaw entirely, placed on a train heading east with forged papers identifying her as a Polish Catholic widow, traveling to stay with family in the countryside. The plan was desperate and improvised, relying on the chaos of wartime movement to obscure her trail, gambling that German bureaucracy would be too overwhelmed to track one Jewish woman among millions being displaced by the war. Stanisław watched Ruth leave that church in the darkness before dawn, watched her walk away from her daughter without looking back, because turning around would have broken something inside her that needed to remain intact for survival. The baby remained with Helena, who took the infant home and introduced her to neighbors as the child born from her fake pregnancy, accepting congratulations and advice from people who had no idea they were participating in an elaborate deception. The birth certificate was forged by Thomas, with Helena listed as the mother, and a fictitious father whose death in combat explained his absence, creating a paper trail that would withstand casual inspection, if not the rigorous investigation that Kruger was likely to conduct. November arrived with early snow and increasing signs that the network's time was running out. Kruger had been conducting interviews throughout the hospital, questioning nurses and administrators about Stanisław's activities, comparing testimonies to identify inconsistencies in the stories people told about births and deaths and the chaotic record-keeping that the war had supposedly caused. Several nurses who had assisted with swaps were showing signs of cracking under the pressure, their nerves frayed by months of living with secrets that could result in execution. One nurse named Chadwiger had actually approached Stanisław asking to be released from the operation, explaining that she could not sleep anymore, that every unexpected knock on her door triggered panic attacks, that she had children of her own to consider, and could not justify risking their orphaning for the sake of Jewish babies she would never see again. Stanisława granted the release without judgment because she understood that courage was not infinite, that terror accumulated until it broke even the strongest people, that forcing someone to continue under such conditions would only accelerate the exposure they were all trying to avoid. But Jadwiga's departure created a gap in the network, meant fewer trusted hands available to assist with swaps, reduced their capacity at precisely the moment when deportations from the ghetto were reaching their final, most murderous phase. The emotional landscape of the maternity ward had become surreal, a place where routine medical procedures coexisted with clandestine resistance operations, where German officers might be inspecting records in one room while Jewish mothers labored in secret 2 doors away. Stanisława found herself living in a state of permanent dissociation, her consciousness split between the mundane requirements of hospital administration and the life-or-death decisions she was making multiple times per week. She delivered babies for the wives of Nazi officers, providing the same skilled care she gave to everyone, smiling and accepting their gratitude while knowing that in another part of the hospital, she was actively undermining the racial policies their husbands enforced. The contradiction was almost philosophical, a demonstration that human beings could contain multitudes of conflicting identities and motivations, that evil and good could exist in close proximity without necessarily contaminating each other. But the strain was showing in her face, in the gray that had overtaken her hair, in the tremor that appeared in her hands during moments of stress. Her own family was beginning to ask questions she could not answer, beginning to notice that their mother was involved in something dangerous that she refused to discuss. The circle of knowledge was expanding whether she wanted it to or not. And with each new person who learned the truth, the probability of exposure increased exponentially until it approached certainty. December 1942 arrived with temperatures cold enough to freeze the tears that Stanisława no longer allowed herself to shed in public. And with it came the operation that would either prove the culmination of everything she had built, or the catastrophe that destroyed it. A woman named Esther Goldman appeared at the hospital 8 months pregnant with twins, a complication that made her case exponentially more difficult than anything Stanisława had attempted before. Twins meant double the risk, double the documentation, double the number of Christian families needed to absorb the children, and double the chances that some detail would fail to align perfectly enough to escape Kruger's increasingly focused scrutiny. The resistance contacts who brought Esther to Stanisława argued that turning her away would mean condemning not 1, but 2 children to certain death, that the moral calculus actually demanded more risk rather than less, when multiple lives hung in the balance. Esther herself said nothing during these debates, simply sat in the examination room with her hands resting on her enormous belly, her eyes tracking the conversation with the exhausted awareness of someone who had already accepted that her fate was in other people's hands, that her only remaining power was the ability to endure whatever came next with something resembling dignity. The plan that emerged required recruiting 2 Christian families simultaneously, coordinating their stories, so that both claimed to have given birth on the same night, creating a coincidence that would seem implausible under normal scrutiny, but might be accepted in the chaos of wartime record-keeping. Helena volunteered to take 1 twin, arguing that she had already successfully integrated 1 Jewish baby into her home and could manage another with the story that she had actually delivered twins, but initially only reported 1 child due to confusion in the delivery room. A second family was found through Father Marson's network, a couple named the Nowakowskis, who had lost their only child to diphtheria 3 months earlier and were willing to accept a Jewish infant if it meant filling the void that grief had carved into their lives. The logistics were nightmarish because Esther would need to labor in secret, while Stanisława somehow produced documentation showing that 2 different Christian women had given birth to single infants on the same night, requiring coordination with Thomas the clerk and at least 3 nurses who would have to corroborate the false narratives if questioned. Every variable that could go wrong was multiplied by 2. Every potential point of exposure doubled, and the entire operation depended on timing that could not be precisely controlled because babies arrived on their own schedules regardless of human planning. Esther went into labor on December 15th, during an evening when the hospital was already overwhelmed with casualties from a bombing raid that had struck a residential neighborhood, creating exactly the kind of chaos that made covert operations possible. Stanisław moved Esther to a private room that technically should have been reserved for German officers' wives, but was temporarily empty, a gamble that could be explained away as responding to emergency conditions, if anyone questioned it. The labor progressed rapidly, too rapidly for Stanisława's comfort, because she needed time to ensure that Helena and the Nowakowskis were in position to receive the babies. Time to coordinate with the nurses who would create the false documentation. Time to verify that Kruger was not conducting one of his surprise inspections that had become increasingly frequent. The first twin emerged screaming into the world at 9:47 in the evening, a boy with dark hair and the robust constitution of someone determined to survive despite being born into circumstances designed to kill him. The second twin followed 18 minutes later, a girl smaller than her brother but equally vocal, and Stanisława held both infants for a moment that felt suspended between past and future, understanding that her next actions would determine whether these children lived or died, whether their mother's suffering would be redeemed or rendered meaningless. The separation happened with mechanical efficiency that masked the emotional violence of what was occurring. Esther was given perhaps 2 minutes with her twins before Stanisław took them away under the pretense of necessary medical examinations, a lie that Esther almost certainly saw through but accepted because the alternative was unthinkable. The boy was wrapped in blue blankets and taken to Helena, who was waiting in a different section of the hospital, claiming to be in labor herself, her fake pregnancy reaching its scripted conclusion. The girl was wrapped in pink and delivered to the Nowakowskis, who had been coached on how to behave as new parents, how to display the appropriate mixture of exhaustion and joy that would convince any observers that they had just experienced the transformative event of childbirth. The paperwork was being forged in real time by Thomas, who worked in a supply closet with a flashlight and a collection of official stamps he had spent months stealing or copying, his hands shaking from the pressure of creating documents that would need to withstand potential forensic analysis if Kruger decided to investigate thoroughly. 3 nurses rotated through the maternity ward, creating a narrative of controlled chaos, of a busy night where record-keeping was necessarily imperfect. But the broad strokes were accurate enough to satisfy bureaucratic requirements. What no one had anticipated was that one of the nurses assisting with the twin delivery, a woman named Katarzyna, who had previously been reliable, would experience a moral crisis in the immediate aftermath of the swap. She found Stanisława in the corridor 30 minutes after the operation was complete and announced that she could not continue, that watching Esther's face as her babies were taken away had broken something inside her, that she was terrified of going to hell for participating in deceptions that violated the natural bond between mother and child. Katarzyna was crying as she said this, her voice rising to dangerous volumes in a hospital where German officers were treating wounded soldiers. 3 floors away, and Stanisława had to make an instant calculation about whether this woman represented an immediate threat to the entire network. The decision was brutal and necessary. She took Katarzyna to a private office, locked the door, and spent 20 minutes systematically dismantling her crisis through a combination of emotional manipulation and veiled threats. She reminded Katarzyna that backing out now would not undo her participation, that she was already complicit in months of swaps and could be executed just as easily for past crimes as for future ones. She explained that if Katarzyna went to the authorities out of guilt or fear, she would not be saving her soul, but merely ensuring that all the babies already saved would be discovered and killed, that her confession would murder retroactively every child they had managed to place with Christian families. The psychological pressure was immense and possibly cruel, but it worked because Katarzyna emerged from that office with red eyes and a renewed commitment to silence, understanding that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, that the only path forward was deeper into the conspiracy until either the war ended or they were all discovered. The unraveling began 3 days after the twin operation, when Kruger arrived at the hospital with a file folder thick enough to contain months of accumulated evidence and an arrest warrant that had Stanisław's name typed across the top in clean bureaucratic typeface. He brought 6 soldiers with him, not the usual administrative escort, but combat troops carrying rifles and wearing expressions that suggested they expected resistance. Stanisława was in the middle of a routine delivery when they entered the maternity ward, and she made the split-second decision to finish helping the laboring mother rather than flee. Understanding that running would confirm guilt while completing a medical procedure might buy precious minutes for the network to respond, she delivered a healthy Christian baby girl while German soldiers stood in the doorway watching, their presence transforming an act of creation into something that felt like a public execution. When the umbilical cord was cut and the infant placed in her mother's arms, Stanisława washed her hands with deliberate slowness, drying each finger individually, buying time she knew was probably worthless, but could not stop herself from seeking. Kruger waited with the patience of someone who understood that his prey had nowhere to run, that every exit was covered, that this confrontation had been inevitable since the moment she had swapped her first baby 16 months earlier. The interrogation room at Gestapo headquarters on Suture Avenue was designed to break people through atmosphere, before violence was even necessary, with walls that seemed to absorb sound and light that came from angles calculated to disorient and exhaust. Kruger sat across from Stanisława with her hospital records spread before him. Each anomaly marked with red ink, each statistical impossibility highlighted as evidence of systematic fraud. He detailed his investigation with the pride of a craftsman, explaining his work, describing how he had cross-referenced birth certificates with maternal blood types, how he had interviewed families and noticed inconsistencies in their stories about deliveries, how he had traced the pattern of Jewish infant deaths that corresponded exactly with unexplained spikes in Christian births. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming in its accumulation, creating a picture that admitted no innocent explanation. Stanisława listened without confirming or denying anything, her silence, a kind of resistance that frustrated Kruger precisely because it denied him the satisfaction of her confession. He wanted her to acknowledge the cleverness of his detective work, to admit that he had bested her through superior intelligence and systematic investigation. Instead, she gave him nothing. Just blank eyes and a posture that suggested she had already accepted whatever fate he had planned for her. What saved Stanisława's life in that moment was not mercy or justice, but the chaotic priorities of a regime stretched thin by military reversals that were beginning to suggest the Third Reich might not be eternal after all. Kruger received an urgent message halfway through the interrogation. Something about a partisan attack on a supply convoy that required his immediate attention because his expertise was apparently needed elsewhere. He left Stanisława in the interrogation room for 4 hours, long enough for her to contemplate every possible outcome and accept that torture was likely, that death was probable, that her only remaining choice was whether to resist long enough to give the network time to scatter or to break immediately and minimize her own suffering. But when Kruger returned, he did not bring instruments of torture or even additional questions. Instead, he informed her that she was being transferred to Auschwitz, not for immediate execution, but for labor assignment, a decision that made no sense given the severity of her alleged crimes, until Stanisława understood that even the machinery of genocide was subject to bureaucratic inefficiency and competing priorities. Someone higher in the Nazi hierarchy had apparently decided that her medical skills were too valuable to waste on a firing squad, that she could be more useful delivering Aryan babies in the camps than rotting in a Warsaw prison cell. The journey to Auschwitz took 3 days in a cattle car packed with women and children who had been swept up in the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And during those 72 hours, Stanisława experienced the full horror of the system she had been fighting against, with her small acts of document forgery and baby swapping. The cattle car had no sanitation facilities, no ventilation beyond cracks in the wooden walls, no food or water for the entire journey. Children cried until they had no more tears. Mothers tried to comfort them with lies about their destination. And old women simply sat in silence, waiting for death with the resignation of people who had seen too much to maintain hope. Stanisława used her medical training to help where she could, assisting women who went into labor in those impossible conditions, holding the hands of children dying from dehydration, maintaining some fragment of human dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away completely. She understood during that journey that her baby-swapping operation, which had felt so significant in Warsaw, was barely a footnote in the industrial-scale destruction the Nazis had engineered, that her 30 or 40 saved children were drops in an ocean of millions being murdered with bureaucratic efficiency. The realization was simultaneously devastating and oddly liberating because it freed her from the weight of believing her individual actions mattered in any cosmic sense, allowed her to accept that she had simply done what was possible in her small corner of hell without needing to believe it added up to redemption. Auschwitz was worse than anything she had imagined. Worse than the rumors that had circulated through the Warsaw underground. Worse than the nightmares that had plagued her during the months of the swapping operation. The camp was a factory of death operating at full capacity, with trains arriving daily to disgorge their human cargo onto a selection platform, where SS doctors decided with casual gestures who would work and who would die immediately in gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. Stanisława was assigned to the camp hospital, a cruel parody of medical care, where she would spend the next 2 years delivering babies who were usually murdered within hours of birth, where her skills as a midwife would be perverted into service of a regime dedicated to extermination. She witnessed horrors that made her previous moral compromises seem quaint by comparison. Watched children torn from mothers' arms and thrown into trucks heading to the crematoriums. Saw medical experiments conducted on prisoners without anesthesia. Learned that the human capacity for cruelty was essentially infinite when sanctioned by authority and normalized through repetition. Yet even in Avits, Stanisława continued her resistance in whatever microscopic ways were possible. Sometimes hiding newborns for a few extra hours to give them that much more life. Sometimes falsifying medical records to save prisoners from selection for execution, maintaining the same stubborn insistence on mercy that had motivated her baby-swapping operation, even though the context had become so extreme that mercy itself seemed like a mean English concept. Stanisława survived Avits through a combination of medical utility, random luck, and a stubbornness that bordered on supernatural, emerging from the camp in January 1945, when Soviet forces liberated the facility and discovered the full extent of what had been occurring behind the electrified fences. She weighed less than 90 lb, her body ravaged by typhus and malnutrition, her hands still capable of delivering babies, but shaking with a tremor that would never fully disappear. The liberation brought no immediate joy, because Stanisława had witnessed too much death to process survival as victory. Had seen the crematorium chimneys belching smoke day and night, had delivered babies in that hellish hospital, knowing most would be murdered before they learned to recognize their mothers' faces. She learned during those first chaotic days after liberation that the Warsaw network had been largely destroyed, that Father Markin had been executed, that Tomas had been tortured to death without revealing names, that several of the nurses who had assisted with swaps had simply disappeared into the Nazi arrest system and were presumed dead. The resistance structure that had enabled her baby-swapping operation had been dismantled with the same efficiency the Reich applied to everything, leaving behind only fragments and survivors scattered across Europe, trying to piece together what had happened to the people and causes they had risked everything to protect. The question that consumed Stanisława during her slow recovery in a Soviet military hospital was whether any of the babies she had saved had actually survived the war. Whether her months of deception and risk had produced anything more than temporary reprieves before the machinery of genocide caught up with everyone. She had no way of knowing because the documentation she had so carefully forged was designed to be untraceable. The entire point of the operation had been to make those children disappear into Christian Polish society so thoroughly that no investigation could reveal their origins. Helena Kowalska had vanished, possibly fled Warsaw, or possibly killed during the uprising that had destroyed much of the city in 1944. The Nowakowskis were rumored to have escaped to the countryside, but their exact fate was unknown. Ruth, the mother who had given birth in Father Marcin's church basement, was almost certainly dead, because survival rates for Jewish women who had been in the Warsaw Ghetto were microscopically small. The twins Stanisława had delivered in that desperate December operation might be alive, or might be corpses buried in mass graves. And there was no database she could consult, no record she could search, no way to verify whether her crimes against bureaucracy had translated into actual saved lives, or merely postponed inevitable deaths. What Stanisława did not know during those months of recovery was that the Soviet occupation of Poland would prove almost as hostile to the truth of what she had done as the Nazi regime had been. The new communist government had no interest in celebrating stories of individual heroism that did not align with their preferred narrative of collective resistance led by party members and Soviet liberators. Her baby-swapping operation was too morally complex, too dependent on Catholic networks and Christian charity, too focused on Jewish victims at a time when the new regime was trying to minimize the Holocaust's distinctly anti-Semitic character in favor of a broader story about fascist violence against all peoples. Stanislawa was told by officials that her wartime activities were best forgotten, that dwelling on the past served no purpose when Poland needed to rebuild and move forward under Soviet guidance. She was denied recognition, denied documentation of her resistance work, effectively erased from the historical record by a system that found her inconvenient. The irony was bitter because she had spent the war creating false identities for Jewish babies. And now her own true identity as a rescuer was being falsified into non-existence by the very government that claimed to represent liberation from Nazi tyranny. The children she had saved began surfacing years later, dozens of them eventually. Young adults who had grown up as Poles with Christian names and Catholic baptismal certificates, and no knowledge of their Jewish origins until some detail failed to align. Some family story did not quite add up. Some genetic test or genealogical investigation revealed that the parents who had raised them were not biologically related. Some of these revelations came from deathbed, confessions by adoptive parents who could no longer carry the secret. Others emerged through systematic efforts by Jewish organizations trying to locate hidden children who had survived the war through exactly the kind of identity swap Stanislawa had orchestrated. Each discovered child represented a thread, connecting back to those desperate months in Warsaw, when Stanislawa had played God with birth certificates and family trees, when she had made decisions that reverberated through generations. Some of the children were grateful when they learned the truth, viewing their survival as a gift regardless of the deception involved. Others were devastated, their entire sense of self shattered by the revelation that their identities were constructed lies, that their real parents had been murdered while they lived comfortable lives under stolen names. Stanislawa met some of these children in the decades after the war. Awkward reunions where she had to defend decisions made under impossible circumstances to people whose lives had been permanently altered by her choices. The psychological aftermath followed Stanislawa for the remaining 4 decades of her life, manifesting as nightmares and guilt, and a persistent sense that she had failed, despite whatever success the numbers might suggest. She kept lists and notebooks hidden in her Warsaw apartment, compulsive records of every baby she could remember swapping, every mother whose child she had taken, every Christian family who had accepted a Jewish infant. The lists were incomplete because memory was fallible, and wartime chaos had made perfect record-keeping impossible. But she maintained them with religious devotion, as if documenting the names could somehow redeem the violence of what she had done to families in the name of saving individual children. She attended Catholic Mass daily, confessing the same sins repeatedly to priests who told her she had nothing to repent, that saving lives was never sinful, regardless of the methods employed. But Stanislawa could not escape the knowledge that she had built her rescue operation on a foundation of lies and theft, that she had stolen babies from mothers and given them to strangers, that the children she saved grew up not knowing their true names or histories or families. The arithmetic of Holocaust rescue was always impossible because every saved life was purchased at tremendous cost to other people's sense of truth and identity and family coherence. And Stanislawa understood too well that heroism and trauma were often indistinguishable when examined from certain angles, that the children who called her a savior might just as easily have called her a kidnapper if circumstances had been slightly different. Stanis Leszczyńska died in 1974 at the age of 78 in the same Warsaw apartment where she had hidden her lists and notebooks. Her passing noted in a brief obituary that described her as a midwife who had worked during the war without mentioning the full scope of what she had actually done. The communist authorities maintained their disinterest in her story to the very end, and it would take another decade before researchers and Holocaust historians began piecing together the fragments of her operation, interviewing survivors, and examining forged documents that had somehow survived the destruction of Warsaw. The number of children she saved remains disputed even today, with estimates ranging from 30 to over 50, depending on which testimonies are credited and which documents are accepted as authentic. What is undisputed is that she created an underground network that operated for approximately 16 months before her arrest. That she survived Auschwitz and continued her resistance even in that death factory. That she never sought recognition or compensation for actions she considered simple moral obligations, rather than heroism worthy of commemoration. The debates about her legacy continue in academic circles and among the descendants of the children she swapped. Arguments about whether the ends justified the means, whether saving lives through identity theft was rescue or a different kind of violence, whether the trauma inflicted on families by her deceptions was an acceptable price for physical survival. The children Stanislawa saved, now elderly themselves, if they are still alive, carry complicated relationships with the story of their origins. Some have spent lifetimes searching for biological relatives who were almost all murdered in the Holocaust, pursuing genealogical dead ends and fragmentary records, trying to construct identities that were deliberately erased to keep them alive. Others have rejected the search entirely, choosing to honor the Christian families who raised them, rather than the Jewish families they never knew, viewing Stanislawa's operation as a second birth that matters more than biological origins. A few have converted to Judaism or immigrated to Israel, attempting to reclaim heritage they were separated from before they could form memories. The psychological literature on hidden children describes a particular kind of trauma that comes from discovering your entire identity was constructed to deceive, that your name is false, and your family history is fiction, and the people you thought were your parents were actually strangers who agreed to participate in an elaborate rescue conspiracy. This drama does not negate the fact that these individuals are alive when they should be dead, but it complicates any simple narrative about Stanislawa as a pure heroine. Reminds us that Holocaust rescue was always morally complex and psychologically damaging, even when it was physically successful. The historical amnesia that surrounded Stanislawa's story for decades after her death was not accidental, but reflected deep discomfort with the moral ambiguities her operation represented. The preferred narratives of Holocaust rescue tend to feature righteous Gentiles who hid Jews in attics or smuggled them across borders. Stories that are emotionally satisfying because they do not require confronting the violence inherent in survival strategies that depended on destroying identities and separating families. Stanislawa's baby-swapping operation cannot be processed through these comfortable frameworks because it forces recognition that saving Jewish children often meant erasing their Jewishness. That rescue and cultural genocide sometimes operated through identical mechanisms. That the line between savior and kidnapper depended entirely on context and outcome rather than method. The communist regime found this complexity politically inconvenient, and even post-communist Poland has struggled with how to commemorate someone whose heroism was inseparable from deception, and whose methods violated the natural bonds between mothers and children that most societies consider sacred. Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial, eventually recognized Stanislawa as righteous among the nations. But the honor came decades after her death and remains contested by some scholars, who argue that the recognition celebrates actions that had traumatic consequences for the very people they saved. What makes Stanislawa Legzinska's story crucial, despite or perhaps because of its moral complexity, is that it reveals the impossible choices that ordinary people faced under Nazi occupation. The way genocide forced even acts of resistance to take forms that violated fundamental ethical principles. She was not a superhero making dramatic rescues, but a midwife who understood that her professional skills gave her access to the most vulnerable moment in human life. The hours after birth, when identity is fluid and documentation determines fate. She exploited that vulnerability systematically and deliberately, turning her maternity ward into a site where Jewish babies could be disappeared and reappeared as Christian children through nothing more than altered paperwork and coordinated lies. The operation required not just Stanislawa's courage, but the complicity of dozens of nurses, clerks, priests, and Christian families who agreed to participate in deceptions that could have gotten them executed, who accepted that saving lives in wartime sometimes meant committing acts that would be criminal under normal circumstances. The network she built demonstrated both the best and worst of human nature. The capacity for sacrifice and solidarity alongside the capacity for deception and identity theft, all mixed together in ways that make simple moral judgments impossible. The final tragedy of Stanislawa's story is how thoroughly it was forgotten, how a woman who risked everything to save children died in obscurity, while the children themselves often grew up not knowing they had been saved or who had saved them. The communist regime's suppression of her story meant that for decades the operation existed only in fragmentary, airy memories and hidden documents in the confused recollections of elderly survivors, and the incomplete records of bureaucrats who had not understood what they were documenting. Even today, with more attention finally being paid to her wartime activities. The full scope of what she accomplished remains unclear, because the very success of her deceptions means that some of the children she saved may still not know their true origins, may be living as Poles with no idea that they were born Jewish and survived only because a midwife committed elaborate fraud on their behalf. These unknown cases represent the ultimate achievement of Stanisław's operation. Children whose false identities were so perfectly constructed that they remain undetected, even 70 years after the war ended. But they also represent the profound cost of that achievement. Lives saved at the expense of truth, survival purchased through permanent erasure of identity and history and family connection. In the end, Stanisław Chinska was neither pure hero nor villain, but something more complicated and more human. A woman who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances and lived with the consequences until the day she died. Her legacy is contested and complex as the war that made her actions necessary.